The Monopoly money will be handed out shortly. I'm Clark McGinn from Uplifting Advice. My role in this industry is to encourage people not to make the mistakes they made in the past, but to make brand new mistakes in the future. Last year's conference feedback was very important to Al and Louisa and the team, and one thing that came through very strikingly was the desire to have a bit more humour and a bit more drama. And so, in response to that, we're giving you this new focus on competition law at 4:30 on Monday afternoon. I'm going to be helped, though, by my two colleagues here who know what they're talking about, unlike me, Solange Leandro of WFW and Zohar Zik of HFW, two lawyers very experienced in this field. And Solange, would you like to just give us a bit of introduction about you and the firm?
Well, hello, it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope I'm not contributing to the drama. And, well, humor I cannot promise. I'm a competition lawyer after all, but I'll try. So I'm a competition partner at Watson Farley Williams. I specialize in aviation for almost 20 years. Yeah, it's a sector that never ceases to surprise. And I'll leave it at that until we go to our conversation.
Zohar.
So I'm also a partner in another law firm, HFW, and my area of expertise is primarily transaction, but my experience with competition is actually as advising counsel, both as general counsel of a large airline group that went through a large merger, as well as external counsel to clients.
Oh, thank you both, and welcome joining. Thank you for joining us. I want to say, just before we start, what we're not going to talk about today are specific deals that may or may not be in the market. And we're not going to play buy it bingo by suggesting who should be merging with whom over the next time. So this is going to be a bit general, and I'll ask you to keep any questions you have in a general sense too. So in terms of competition law, Solange, are we talking about huge global M&As? Are we talking about diversifications? Are we talking about portfolio sales? What is competition law?
Well, it affects everything that has an impact on the market. So competition law, and we are looking at more at monopoly, so merger control, we're not talking about dominance here, is a global matter. So it's some markets, and we discussed about fixed wing and helicopters. So the fixed wing market is more global, and whereas the helicopter market tends to be more national due to the characteristics of the market. So that also shows a difference in approach of the regulators. So fixed wing led by the European Commission, because you've got global markets, and it's a global business, as we mentioned. So a merger filing in the EU is not only in the EU, it's wherever the parties have business. So it's a global matter and has to be managed consistently. And then helicopters tend to be looked at by national regulators. And the UK CMA has been very active in this market and is one of the most experienced competition authorities. But experienced because they looked at this into detail at the expense of the parties. So that is the...
And Zohar, I know you've done transactions in competition. Yeah, how complicated is the process?
Well, it is very complicated because the initial idea of a merger sounds very appealing financially for both parties. But it is very complicated because you need to anticipate what is going to be the impact of that very interesting transaction on the process. And as Solange mentioned, you don't need to look at the immediate market, you also need to look at various jurisdictions where you're active or you might be perceived to be active and take consideration of those. It's also important to note that each country has its own regime. So some countries require notification of a merger in advance of reaching agreement, and some, like the UK, is a voluntary regime. So the parties can decide to merge, and then they announce, and then they need to either notify the regulator, or the regulator may find out, as is the case in the UK, who have a very active intelligence unit who look for mergers to drag their attention, and then they announce an investigation into the planned merger. So it's not only that you need to agree the terms with a potential party, you also really need to think about the impact of that and to do quite a lot of due diligence and go to quite a lot of expense and time and management time, which is not really accounted for, to understand exactly what you're getting yourself into.
And so geographies have different regulatory regimes, some more business-friendly, some less business-friendly. Would that
Absolutely.
be fair?
Yes, so you've got, as a more experienced authorities and other regimes that have a more formalistic approach. So globally, and just to give you an idea, what I do on a daily basis or weekly basis, it's global desktop analysis, where sometimes merger filings are triggered in jurisdictions that are not impacted by the specific transaction because of a formality. Because one of the parties in some jurisdictions, a client called them exotic jurisdictions, and it's sufficient to trigger a merger filing. And this has to be part of the very early on from the risk management and also the business evaluation. And it's something that it is very important. It is a regulatory burden, but it's something that can be managed early on if the parties discuss. Because if by the end when the parties are about to sign, if they realize there is a merger filing, as Zohar mentioned, some regimes are voluntary, so there are no penalties for not filing, like the UK, Singapore, Australia for the moment. But other regimes, it is suspensory, and the fines are considerable. So in the EU, we are talking about 100 million for gun jumping. Around the member states, and early this morning I had a call, and for instance in Germany, it was 4 million recently that was imposed on the parties because they just completed a merger without notifying. And some jurisdictions catch minority investments as well. So it's a wide net. So it's important to do this initial analysis to manage risk and manage the transaction appropriately.
So it's not just taking over another competitor. It could actually be just selling a part of your business or having an investor coming in.
Yeah. It can be any aspect that will impact competition. And I think that the interesting thing in our particular market, which is the helicopter market, where you have, there is no end consumer as such.
Yes.
The end consumer, which the competition is aimed to protect, is not really there because it's very indirect, is the kind of the cost, say, for the oil and gas. It would be the price of your gas or the price that you pay the pump. But actually, the players who are impacted directly by this merger would be a big, sophisticated organization, a leasing company, an oil major, a helicopter operator. And therefore, it's slightly complex way of analyzing the impact of the merger. The other thing I would note, before we move on, is that you don't only need to look at the impact and filing and to expect that this process is going to take time. It's also that this process, the approvals may come with strings attached. And when you assess the merger and the benefits of the merger, you need to take into account and look very, very carefully at your network, at the network of the combined entity to try to anticipate, and it's not always possible, but to try to anticipate as much as possible what aspect of the business might need to be divested, and then to see whether the merger makes sense with the divestment having taken place, whether there is still merit in the merged entity.
It's very kind of the regulators to look after poor little Chevron and poor little BP, so we should be thankful to them for that. Now, if we look back a couple of decades ago to the helicopter industry, big players like CHC and Bristol came together by merging various businesses, either in-country or globally. Is it much more complicated now, do you think?
It's not, from a regulatory perspective, it's not more complicated. It's the regulators are more sensitive. We're talking about the immediate consumers. But if you look at the recent decisions, the competition authorities don't take into account the fact that you've got very sophisticated and customers with a very high buyer power on the other side, because they look at the fact that once a competitor is out of the market, you cannot replace. There is no buyer power that could replace that absence, because you've got 4 into 3, and you are talking about small markets or narrow markets. I don't want to call them oligopolistic because they've got other connotations, but we are talking about a very few operators, very specialized, and that is the response of to the reality of the market. But the regulators will look at the indirect effects, so the pass on. If there is an increase in price on these services, what would be the pass on to the final consumer? And that is the key concern of the regulators. It is changing, both in the UK and in the EU, but this has been the approach in the past couple of years.
And how do the regulators look at this? Is it the number of assets, the total value, revenues?
It depends on how they define the market. I mean, for the most recent decisions, it's been by revenue and also hours flown. So this is the most recent decision. You look at the market from revenue gives an indication, because you need the total of the market and then you need to calculate. But you also need capacity, because that is what is the potential of the market. And that's where the regulators look at what is the demand and what is the supply. So we need to look at both sides. And that's where there are some battles, and there's a lot of education and time, management time, to educate regulators, to explain how the market works. Because all this knowledge comes at a cost. And it's a cost to the parties. When there is a substantial merger where you got an increment of market share, although the regulators say we don't look at market share, we look at supply, they will consider the market share, because it gives them market power.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
Zohar, so people should come in early then, should they?
Absolutely, but it's also that in the UK it would be the market share and the value, but in other jurisdictions, more exotic jurisdiction, it might actually look at the number of assets exchanging hands, in which case, so you need to really understand what you're going through. And there was one portfolio acquisition that I was involved in that involves some very exotic jurisdictions where there was a lack of clarity as to whether we needed to file or not need to file, and then there is a whole discussion in advance of the discussions and agreements as to whether we need to take these precautionary measures in these particular jurisdictions. Yeah. The other thing is that it's, especially in the helicopter industry context, it's actually counterintuitive, because a bigger player might be able to command cheaper capital cost on the assets and be able to negotiate better with the oil majors in order to reduce costs. So actually providing for large operators could reduce cost overall, but this is not necessarily the way the competition authorities look at. They look at the number of competitors in a bid. So that's a bit odd. And another thing to think about is that nowadays the government, at least here in the UK and maybe in America, they seem to be a little bit more pro-business and they want business done. And recently the head of the CMA has changed to someone who is perceived to be a bit more pro-business. And it might be that the way they apply the rules, they won't change the rules, but the way they apply the rules when analyzing a proposed merger would be different, and it's slightly more business orientated.
That's interesting. Just thinking, moving away from the operators and speaking about helicopter leasing companies, without specifics, of course, there are many, many fixed-wing lessors.
Absolutely.
And relatively few helicopter lessors. Is that an issue in competition terms?
Potentially, yes. Yeah.
That's the nature of the market, but there's an issue that we cannot address. And that's something that has to be put forward to the regulators. And it's going to be interesting to see if the regulators are going to be more receptive to these arguments, because what the regulators traditionally have resisted consolidation because they look at consolidation as a reduce in customer choice. And therefore, the remaining operators can increase their prices. But with the the new chairman of the CMA coming from Amazon, it was very controversial. Yeah. Also in the EU, the new competition commissioner, doesn't come from a competition background. He comes from an environmental background. So it's going to be interesting to see. There are a lot of discussion about how regulators can promote and can business, but their main focus is still consumer protection because they need to justify their existence and the public money that they spend on this investigation. So it's something that is going to be interesting to see, and I hope that they will be more receptive to the industry arguments and understand the market better and the market dynamics.
That's quite interesting. So you talk about persuading the regulator of putting your case. How does that work in practice, Zohar?
Well, in some cases, you will actually approach them informally, but when you have discussions. In some cases, you would take a view that because it's voluntary, that the impact of the merger is not going to be that substantial to reach the thresholds that trigger that competition element. And then you take a view that maybe we go ahead and then see if they come to us. Yeah. So again, the preparation in advance is very important. Another aspect, we are talking about merger control, which is a very important and relevant aspect of this. But there's also, in the discussion, there is another aspect of competition which is very important and potentially criminal, which is price fixing and competing when you have two merging entities, both in the lessor end or in the operator end. When they start discussing this merger, they are still competitors. And they will need to ensure that their discussions do not impact the competition between them in terms of price fixing, agreeing, sharing information that could impact the ultimate pricing, because this could be very, very significant in terms of penalties and the way the regulator looks at the ultimate merger when analyzing it.
And that must come at a cost, an operating cost to the parties.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. I mean, this is part of the pre-merger protocols, the clean teams, and keeping the business separate. It's part of the gun jumping, the gun jumping precautions, and that's very important because until there is a clearance, especially there are two ways of obtaining clearance in the regimes where you need to notify any suspensory. You need to obtain clearance before you complete the transaction, before you merge the business. In the UK, or other countries where the system is voluntary, the CMA can investigate. So they normally have 6 months where they will investigate. Their intelligence team is very, very active. They are aware of all especially big businesses and big mergers, and it's important to approach the regulators and work with them, because my experience is that it's much easier to start from a story your own story, than coming from the regulator. So, because by the time they come to you, they have their own story in their minds. So it's much easier to put forward your story, especially in a case where there will be a substantial increment of market share. So we've got more than, and the threshold in the UK is 25%. Okay. For one of we've got turnover, but you also have market share as in other countries. And if you get 30%, from 30% upwards, it's important to consider the strategy. Mm-hmm. Are we going to contact regulators early on in the merger, or are we going to wait and submit the filing? I mean, in the EU, you need to have pre-merger discussions. In the UK, it's voluntary, so it's part of the strategy of the team.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think you mentioned it's not a binary yes or no. Sometimes approval can be given, but with some sort of conditions. Yes. What might those conditions be What's the sort of shopping list?
Well, the preferred shopping list is the clean conditions, which is divestment, because the regulators, and more recently, the regulators prefer an upfront buyer. So they have a clear way out, because there's been a lot of commitments in the aviation industry that have not been taken. So there were commitments offered by the parties, and then there was no uptake from the market. So the regulators prefer an upfront buyer, upfront solution. This is expensive because it means that parties have to appoint a monitoring trustee to manage all this procedure, and they have to. All of these are costs that the regulators are not going to pay for this. So, but they will have to approve the buyers, because they will have to ensure that that solution, the remedy, so the commitment, will address the competition concern, so the substantial lessening of competition, and that buyer will stay on the market and address that specific and not move to another market, because they could take the assets and move to another jurisdiction. They are it can move helicopters, and that's one of or fixed wing, and that's one of the considerations.
Yeah, the other one is timing, because sometimes you need to divest and you need a deadline by which to complete the transaction. Even if you have a buyer, it's not necessarily that the buyer will go ahead with the transaction, because like all transactions, they are not definite until they happen. So suddenly you are in a position where you have an agreed merger. The merger makes sense at the time of agreeing it, but actually you're looking now months and months down the line where nothing happens. You are still committed to the process because you need to manage it, you need to progress it, but at the same time you can benefit from the merger. So this is, again, very risky.
And talking of benefits, Zohar, there's a slightly cheeky question here. Solange, Zohar, how much do you charge to run an aircraft transaction?
I need to intervene. This is confidential information.
What aircraft?
We cannot say it.
You can't say because it's price fixing. Yeah. Okay, no, fair point.
You've been testing us.
So just assume we've price fixed just for a laugh. What are the risks if you get it wrong?
In terms of merger, so we've got, the initial risk is that the transaction, it's not valid, so you need to unwind your transaction. Of course, that for some jurisdictions, this is a risk that can be managed. We are talking about if a jurisdiction, you need to look at where the jurisdiction will have an impact. And sometimes, if you have got a transaction that's not subject to local law, and we are talking about a jurisdiction that is not related to the transaction, if the consequence is unwinding the transaction, it might not be enforceable, but there are penalties. So this comes at the cost, and the exposure is up to 10%. That is in the EU, in the UK. Other jurisdictions, the risk is not as significant, but there is a risk that if you are caught, you'll be on the radar of the regulators, and that it's a more serious risk for jurisdictions where you have activities, and that's probably a risk not worth taking.
And you have a risk of your lawyer tell you, I told you so.
So, do you get a discount for that?
No, this would be an extra charge.
Okay. So as we're looking, the helicopter industry is coming out of many years of awful performance, of oversupply. Yeah, we've heard this morning that Boeing stability is going to be the way forward. Does that help us in terms of competition law, that companies aren't failing? Yeah, is it more positive? What do you think?
If the outlook is more positive, and the market has changed since the CMA reviewed it. If it's more positive, it means there will be potentially new entrants, because the regulators look at existing offer, but also potential new entrants. And we've seen new entrants on the market, which is positive for competition, and it shows that the market is attractive and it will attract companies. So the perceived barrier to entry that the CMA considered that were high, probably that argument is possible to counter, and that's something that it shows that if the market changes, the CMA will have to review the transaction under the market conditions, and that's something that is an ongoing process, is not crystallized. The CMA is open, or the other competition regulators are open to this, and I'll just give an example, and this is on fixed swing, where the European Commission blocked the merger, and 2 years on, the market changed, and they authorized the merger. So it can happen, and it happens, but the parties have to bring a very strong market case and defend it. Not only lawyers, but also competition economists, because this is also very much, the regulators like to have the studies by everything, all the legal arguments quantified by the competition economists. So that's important as well. That's another aspect, another cost.
And I think when we look at this, we analyze what the market is. Right? And I think that what we are facing, it's not immediate, but in the coming future, we're going eVTOL coming into the market, we've got drones coming into the market. So the market, now we have helicopters. So we've got mid-size helicopter, large, smaller ones, but it's helicopters and the operations, and you compare very similar, the same assets in different sizes. Whereas when the market changes and we have different type of assets doing different things, but same providers, then again, it would change things in terms of how we define the market. And when we come to the competition authority with a proposed merger, there will be a different analysis for what is a market. And this is something that we're yet to see how it's going to impact the M&A market.
And that's important because from the supply side, it's important to show that there are alternatives. So if we define the market, it's a wider market, of course, the impact will be diluted. And that's always a struggle, but is not, as I mentioned, is not crystallized. It is possible for the parties to show that the market is wider than what it was considered to be previously by the regulators.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting because, as you said, Solange, the authorities will look at precedents and new entrants. If we take the fixed wing market, there's many more capital transactions, M&As, divestments, portfolio sales, compared to our relatively small and relatively illiquid market. So does that make it just more complicated to persuade the competition authority because there are fewer helicopter transactions?
Well, it is the market. It's the market in fixed wing. There is more. It's a completely different market. We are talking about commercial aviation, and the market is defined differently. And we are O&D. So it's all has to do with the impact on the market. What is the relevant market? And this is the starting point and the ending point. Because if we define the market, then all the other arguments will refer to what is the real impact of the transaction. And and hopefully we'll be able to produce arguments that won't have a real impact, or that the impact, there won't be consumer harm, because there are sufficient benefits to outweigh the perceived restrictions, because regulators want to see competition. They want to see as many operators, as many providers as possible. Sometimes it's not possible. It's not possible to increase the market because there is not sufficient demand. So, and that is the struggle with the regulators, to show them what is the reality of the market, because they don't know the market. And that's also an education cost, that in every transaction, especially the ones when you've got a precedent, and the regulator can depart from a precedent, but they have that precedent. So that will be their starting point.
Okay.
Yeah, the commercial aviation market is completely different to the helicopter because you have an end consumer to protect.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's a very consumer protection-driven issue. If you have BA and Aer Lingus wanting to merge, then there is a real impact on the BA and Aer Lingus passengers, or whether they are going to be more expensive or less expensive tickets. So the market, the helicopter market, is very, very different and very unique, and therefore, it's, as Solange said, it's very important when you start a merger or merger talks, is to create a narrative and to deliver your own narrative. So that's what drives the discussions, and then you present them with a good story to tell, and then they need to validate it rather than come up with their own narrative for you to respond to something that they may come up with points which they simply don't understand the market, or you don't understand your business or the rationale behind your merger, which can actually be very positive to all concerned.
Yeah.
And very importantly, the regulators have the powers to do a proper market assessment and market research. So they go to the market and they will send questionnaires. So what happens is when you notify or when they start a merger inquiry, they will send a questionnaire to the entire market, to customers, to suppliers, to main competitors, to understand what is the reaction. And that is the important, and this is something that the parties need to be ready to respond to respond to all this reaction from the market. This is the market inquiry powers, and the regulators do this in all the mergers. Many of you have received a market a questionnaire from a regulator on a merger that is unrelated to, or it is indirectly related to your business, or directly related to your business. And that's something that they will take. Third-party market reaction is important. It will take into account in the analysis. If there is resistance from the market, of course, the regulators will look into that in more detail. I mean, having said that, most of mergers go through in phase one. So very few mergers go into phase two, but some go, and these are the ones that raise more concerns and are more troublesome and burdensome for the parties that intend to merge.
So in summary then, it's complicated, competitive, and you've got to get it right first time.
Yes, but it's not unsurmountable.
Yeah.
It is possible to manage.
It is not insurmountable if you pay the right firm the right fee. Solange, Zohar, thank you very much for helping us tonight. That's the end of the competition and the beginning of the competition. Handing over to Mike. Thank you. That was good.
And big thanks to Clark McGinn of Uplifting Advice and his panel for making competition law interesting, compelling and relevant to this session. Thank you.